Hello and welcome back. This is the week 14 lecture. So this is the final lecture of the semester. We are going to discuss our final film, Shakespeare in Love. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the movie though, not because there isn't plenty to say, but just because I would like to move on and talk a little bit about our final paper here in this final lecture. It's my last chance to present information, so I would just like to go over some basic strategies to help you guys get started on the paper. I'd like to talk a little bit about the research requirement and just some things that you might find helpful, but we'll also talk a little bit near the end of lecture about next week's video conferences. So we don't have any new material in week 15. We don't have any other films to watch. I will not have anything new for you in week 15. That is the final week of class, but I would like to meet with each of you individually through Zoom over the course of week 15 so we can talk about your papers. You can tell me kind of how things are going. We can talk about your ideas, your argument, research, any questions that you might have as well. So that's how I would like to sort of wrap up the semester. So this is our final lecture, our final film, and we don't have a discussion board this week, but you guys are still free to write about this film if you would like to write about it for your final response paper, which is going to be due at the end of this week. Feel free. I sort of encourage you guys to maybe get started on those responses a little bit early, because we are getting a little jammed up now in terms of deadlines and work. So if you've already written it before watching this final film, that's of course fine, but just remember when it comes to the final paper, you need to choose a film, ideally one that you're fond of and one that you like. It's okay to return to one that you've already done a response on if you'd like to expound upon what you wrote in that first response. But just remember, Shakespeare in Love would be an option for the final paper, even if you're not able to write about it in any other fashion. Okay, so let's just go through the film rather quickly. Like I said, I want to keep it brief because I just feel like at this point we should probably devote most of our time and attention to the final paper. But I want to at least cover the film a little just so we can remain consistent. So this is our final film. It takes us up to the end of the 90s. So this comes out in 1998, directed by John Madden, who's actually a British filmmaker. This was really his first big American film. He's gone on to do some other things that are pretty well known, recognizable. He's not famous. He's not really a celebrity like some of the filmmakers we've studied this semester, but he's done several good movies. He's, sort of well respected within the industry, just a real solid sort of, professional, but a little bit different, I would argue, from a lot of the auteurs that we've seen over the course of the semester. We've talked about a lot of these filmmakers, Spike Lee, Kevin Smith, Jim Jarmusch back at the very beginning. Tarantino would probably qualify. These filmmakers who have really become quite famous, quite well known. They've made, several popular films, but they're considered to sort of be, the driving creative force behind their films. A lot of these filmmakers both write and direct. That's kind of an important part, oftentimes, of being considered an auteur. I think we mentioned that expression back at the very beginning of the semester. It's a French term, which just sort of applies to a certain kind of filmmaker. Because as we know, filmmaking is very collaborative. But an auteur is often thought of as a filmmaker who's involved in several different aspects of the filmmaking process. So again, they're writing their own screenplays and they're directing. Oftentimes, they might have a very distinctive visual style that comes through in a lot of their films. That's been true of a lot of our filmmakers as well. In some cases, they might produce, they might have their own production companies. They're controlling the creative process at multiple levels. Oftentimes, John Madden's not really that kind of a filmmaker. He's more of a sort of old school professional, just a pro's pro who comes in to mostly direct other people's screenplays. So we talked about this a little bit last week with Gus Van Sant, who we've actually seen twice, as we know. But we noticed that, or I think, for the most part, we can kind of see that in Good Will Hunting, he's kind of giving us a less showy, a less overtly artistic, offbeat style. And that film, Good Will Hunting, often gets remembered more for its screenplay. And Van Sant's direction, while good and fine and very well done, doesn't usually get talked about quite as much. I think we can find the same situation here with Shakespeare in Love. The direction's good, it's fine, everything looks great, production value is very high here, the film looks good, and Madden is certainly a big part of that. But generally, when people talked about the film, they focused a lot on the screenplay. They focused a lot on the performances. We have a very celebrated cast here, which was also the case last week with Good Will Hunting. But of course, Gwyneth Paltrow won an Oscar for her performance in this film. She won, for Best Actress. Judi Dench, who of course plays Queen Elizabeth, she won an Oscar for Best Supporting Actress. And the film also won the Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. So I think in total, the film won 7 Oscars, 7 Academy Awards. That's a very impressive haul, including Best Picture. And that was a little bit of an upset, the film winning the Best Picture Oscar, because the favorite heading in, I think that was the 71st Academy Award, so it took place early in 99, but you guys know, that's for the previous year. So these were all the films from 98. And the favorite heading in to the ceremony was Saving Private Ryan, directed by Steven Spielberg. Some of you might be familiar with that World War II movie. Very popular. It was the favorite to win Best Picture, but instead Shakespeare in Love won. That was viewed as an upset. A lot of people disagreed. It sort of sparked some debate. I would like to come back to the Oscars, at least briefly, as we wrap up our discussion of the film, because this film kind of lives on, I would argue, in our popular imagination for multiple reasons. Of course, number one, it's just a good movie. People like it. A lot like Good Will Hunting, I would argue that it has a lot of crowd-pleasing elements, and that includes an inventive screenplay, really good performances from a lot of the cast members, but also just kind of we might even call it a mood or an atmosphere that the film creates through a lot of factors. Again, the screenplay is a part of that, acting, directing, but also production design. We should definitely think once again about sets, definitely costumes. With any period piece, we can always think about costumes, hair, and maybe makeup as well, because all of those kind of contribute to create, I would argue, a kind of a unique viewing experience for some of the reasons we're about to discuss, but just a film that a lot of people found to be likable. And we can sort of explore some of the reasons for that. But that's, one reason why it remains well remembered and sort of, still a popular film, just its own quality as a film. But it's also kind of important in a sort of a larger sense, if we're thinking about sort of industry history, and that might not be as interesting to us, but just if we're thinking for a final time here about Miramax, the sort of controversial studio that's had a hand in most of our films here in this third and final unit of the semester. Miramax kind of plays a big role here. Once again, they distribute this film. They don't produce it, but they distribute it, and ultimately take part in the Oscar ceremonies. I believe Harvey Weinstein was listed as a producer. Miramax as a company didn't produce the film. Instead, it was produced by Bedford Falls Productions. We'll talk a little bit about them. But Weinstein was credited as a producer, and then later his company, Miramax, distributed the film. So Miramax kind of got a part of the spotlight here, particularly Weinstein, and it was kind of an infamous thing that happened at the Oscars. A couple of infamous things happened at the Oscars connected to him and Miramax that really kind of changed certain things about the Academy Awards, changed certain things about how films would get promoted. how Best Picture nominees would be promoted, and sort of the sort of PR campaigns that go into all of that. So that might not be as important. We'll just spend a little bit of time on that stuff near the end. So let's talk about the screenplay, because it got a lot of attention and obviously won an Oscar. So it was written by Mark Norman, who's an American screenwriter. I think he's written some fiction and maybe some plays as well. Not super well known, but he co-wrote the screenplay with Tom Stoppard. And that's a name that some of you might recognize. Stoppard is a pretty well-known playwright. I don't know how much we read him today, but he's pretty well-known. He's thought of as a British playwright. I think he was originally from like Czechoslovakia before that country broke up into two separate countries, but he grew up in England. I think his family was like they were non-observant Jews, so I think they might have been like fleeing the Nazis, and they eventually settled in England, and that's where he grew up. And became first a journalist and sort of a theater critic, and then later he began to write plays of his own. His most famous work is probably Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Some of you might be familiar with that. And it kind of gives you a clue into a little bit of what's happening in this film. So Stoppard's famous play is sort of an absurdist, kind of darkly comic story centered around these two minor characters from Hamlet. And it's, again, a sort of an absurdist comedy, I guess you would call it. It got taught pretty commonly for a long time. I had to read it, I think, in college, maybe. At some point, either high school, college, or maybe master's. But it's still taught. It's a famous play, and Stoppard's done some other things. He's primarily known as a playwright, but he's also done some screenplays. But sort of thinking about the fact that he's already been using Shakespeare and kind of riffing on Shakespeare in some of his previous work, we might see how it's, kind of a natural fit for him here. And what we'll notice in the film, it got celebrated, the screenplay was lauded for the way it could sort of juggle a lot of different sort of registers and elements. So on one hand, this is very much sort of revisionist history. I mean, this is a romantic comedy set in Elizabethan England, 1590s London. We have some real people in the film, of course, starting with Shakespeare himself. So the film is using some fact, some real people, and it's using some pretty accurate period details, but at the same time, it's very intentionally anachronistic, meaning there's a lot of anachronisms, details, or touches that wouldn't quite fit into the historical time period. So you guys probably know film critics and scholars sometimes like to attack historical films if they're not getting a lot of the details right, if they're not getting certain period or historical details right. So a lot of times critics will poke holes in a period piece if they find what they think are anachronisms, like, oh, people wouldn't have talked like that, people's clothes wouldn't have looked like that. Or I've even heard the complaint in some scenes, stuff that's said a long time ago, oh, it looks like electric lighting in that scene. They would have only had candlelight. So, people can pick apart details like that. Not everybody cares, but some people do. But what's kind of fun about what Stoppard and Norman do in writing this film is they have fun with certain historical anachronisms. Like, on one hand, they are trying to get a lot of the details right when it comes to set design, clothes, just certain aspects of what life would have been like, what life would have looked like in the 1590s, trying to capture how filthy the streets were, in an era before like modern plumbing, just how gross and dirty it would be outside, kind of how the interiors of buildings would look, and also when we spend time on the stage, trying to capture what sort of an Elizabethan stage or Elizabethan theater would have looked and felt like. So they are true to a lot of those details, but at the same time, they have fun by intentionally inserting certain like modern touches that wouldn't have really existed like that during the time period, but it's sort of a meta or sort of postmodern nod to some people. That's how some people took it. Or it's just almost like a winking acknowledgement that they are, in fact, playing pretty fast and loose with the historical record, with the historical facts. And again, this was a popular movie that I think for us doesn't seem all that different from any other sort of glossy, big budget, well-written, well-made Hollywood production. So that's kind of why I wanted to end with this film. You know, it's not a film that I find to be terribly challenging, even though a lot of people think Shakespeare, or at least reading Shakespeare, can be very challenging. But this film was made for a broad audience. I think we can notice that even if we don't particularly care for the film ourselves. It kind of has this mass market, this mass appeal that I think was reflected in the success of the film. It was critically successful. It was commercially successful. It didn't gross as much as, say, Saving Private Ryan, but it was in the top 10 highest grossing films of that year, which, considering its literary subject matter, I think is pretty good. It's never going to gross as much as like a big action movie or a war movie. It was viewed initially as maybe a little bit more niche, but it reached a huge audience. And again, we'll explore some of those reasons, but I think the screenplay is a big reason. The screenplay is just fun. It's witty, it's inventive, and I think Stoppard and Norman do a nice job of giving us some of Shakespeare's language. So we can appreciate some of the language, particularly, you know, when they're rehearsing the play that is obviously Romeo and Juliet. We can actually hear some of the verse, you know, some of Shakespeare's actual writing, but they don't give us too much of that, because a lot of modern audiences maybe don't want to spend the entire film inhabiting Shakespeare's language. So we sometimes balk at, you know, true faithful adaptations of Shakespearean works if they're, you know, sticking with the language throughout. Those can sometimes be difficult for modern viewers. I used to teach Hamlet years ago in an intro to lit class, and I would use the Kenneth Branagh film version. Some of you may have seen that. You know, a really good film adaptation, but it's very faithful. It's like line for line. They really don't change anything or cut anything out, or at least very little. And I thought it was very dynamic. It can help to watch it in film form, you know, versus, you know, a play. You know, really good acting. Branagh, Kate Winslet's in it. Robin Williams plays a small role in that film. But it was still really tough for a lot of the students to get through. So this might be the way we like to consume Shakespeare the most. We know a lot about him, even if we haven't read him that widely. He is, you know, he does remain sort of a pop culture figure. So we know a little bit about him. We might be a little bit interested in him. A fictional treatment of his life. We might be a little bit interested in hearing some of that language. But again, this film balances that stuff with more modern stuff that might be a little bit more palatable, you know, for a modern reader. So just before we move on, to give you an example of one of these like intentional anachronisms that are sort of, you know, embedded within the screenplay. And again, these are usually played for laughs, but you can think about the scene where Will goes to the apothecary. But it's treated sort of like a modern day therapist's office, right? Like he goes in there and kind of gets on the couch and starts talking about his problems to the apothecary, who's like writing stuff down and taking notes. Again, that's very intentional. It's supposed to be funny. Then the apothecary like writes him a prescription or whatever. So again, sort of taking certain period details, but then putting a little bit of a more modern spin on them, usually for comic effect. One of my favorites is when they're on the boat. Will and Viola are on the boat. And I think this is when, you know, some big reveal has happened. She storms off angrily. He's like going to chase after her as they get to the dock. But before he can go, the boatman has like a screenplay, essentially, or a play that he wants Will to read. You know, again, that's very much supposed to make us think of like modern day Hollywood and how there's a lot of aspiring screenwriters driving cabs cabs or serving you coffee, and sometimes they're looking for a chance to maybe, give you their screenplay so they can get a movie made. So there's a lot of little winking moments like that, and a lot of viewers found those fun. A lot of critics thought those were pretty well done. So that's, I think, part of the reason why the screenplay was sort of lauded. But also, again, we get some of the original language, but we also get a pretty traditional love story between our two leads. Of course, Gwyneth Paltrow and Joseph Fiennes plays Will. So, we can certainly talk about that stuff too, but the other thing I would just point out that a lot of viewers appreciated about the screenplay, lit scholars maybe not so much, is the way they treat the idea of inspiration. And really, a lot of the narrative, of course it's a love story, but a lot of the narrative really could really be described as sort of making the movie, right? It's kind of a movie about making movies, or at least a movie about making a play. So we get a lot of scenes of rehearsal, we get a lot of scenes with the actors sort of collaborating, working together. It's been established by a lot of previous scholars that viewers just like these kinds of moments in cinema, and it really transcends genre. But it's part of the reason, I think, why sports movies are often popular. We always like a group of people, often disparate people, different kinds of people. Maybe there's conflict between them early on, but they come together, they work together, they have a common goal, they overcome obstacles, they bond, and we see the fruits of their labor. That's why we like training montages in sports movies. That's why we like to see sort of ragtag underdog groups come together and accomplish things. So we kind of get that in this movie, but again, it's also kind of about the creative process. It's about how art gets made. But in the way that they portray Will's inspiration, like I said, it did sort of rankle some people in the academy, and we probably don't really care that much, but a lot of lit scholars did point out, and some were just doing it sort of jokingly, whereas others, I think, had a more legitimate problem with it. But they pointed out the fact that it's highly inaccurate to pretend like Will needed to get inspired to write this play through his own personal life or through just sort of the things that he heard. There's that scene where he overhears the street preacher, and then some of that language later shows up in the play. But this idea that he's suffering from writer's block and he needs inspiration. Of course, the film tells us that love is the only inspiration you really need. I'm not sure that that's always true, but this idea that he finds inspiration in these unlikely places, but also, of course, in his own romantic relationship, a lot of lit scholars balked at that and said, no way, that's not realistic at all, because it's ignoring the fact that Romeo and Juliet already existed as a text, or at least that basic plot line already existed. So one thing that we do know about a lot of Elizabethan era playwrights like Shakespeare, but not only him, is a lot of them were adapting older works, often from Italy or other parts of continental Europe. In some cases, they were going back and adapting works from ancient Greece and Rome. So a lot of what appeared on the Elizabethan stage during this time period would not really qualify to us as original works. They were adaptations. A lot of them, would have been changed a good bit. An English playwright would often change the setting. Shakespeare did this at times. He would take maybe an Italian play, but he would change the setting, make it set maybe in England, although a lot of his stuff is set in other parts of Europe like Italy. But you might change the setting, you might change the character names, you might even change certain aspects of the time period. So they were making adjustments, but a lot of these texts were adapted from older texts. So, the textual history has already been done with Romeo and Juliet. It existed in earlier forms, and Shakespeare wasn't the only English playwright to adapt it. Other Elizabethan era playwrights undoubtedly did it too. It's just Shakespeare probably did it the best. His version was the one that got remembered and studied the most. But again, that's a minor quibble. We don't have to care about that, but it might be something to just sort of keep in mind. That's another way that I think the screenwriters made the film in some ways a little bit more modern. This idea of writer's block, this idea of looking for inspiration, that shows up in a lot of modern settings, that shows up in a lot of modern treatments of the artistic process. So I think it's, kind of easy to understand and relate to, even if it's not maybe the most accurate representation of how Shakespeare and other artists from this time period may have worked and come up with material. But again, that was just something that was written about and talked about at the time. But you don't have to be a Shakespeare scholar to like this film. In fact, it's really not made for Shakespeare scholars. It's made for anyone who likes a well-made movie, anyone who likes romantic comedy, or if you like period pieces. Of course, it will appeal on that level as well. But I would just say that, even though you don't have to be an expert on Shakespeare, and you really don't even have to know that many of his plays. Chances are we've all had to read at least something by him, maybe back in high school, maybe as undergrads. Romeo and Juliet gets taught a ton, Hamlet, Macbeth, King Lear, maybe. He's often remembered primarily for his tragedies, but of course he also wrote comedies, he wrote histories, he did other stuff. But again, it doesn't matter how much of him you've read. It doesn't really matter if you like to read Shakespeare all that much. I don't think, just like with Hoop Dreams, you don't have to like basketball, to appreciate the film. Because I think the filmmakers assume that we all know a little bit about Shakespeare, right? We have this sort of popular shared knowledge. And this is true of a lot of famous writers. For those of you who've taken my 451A, you might remember talking about the Poe effect, which is just kind of, to summarize, that's just this idea that a lot of famous writers, particularly from older eras, previous centuries, they get remembered not so much for the text that they wrote, or not so much because everybody reads their texts, but because they just sort of become a part of the popular imagination. But oftentimes they have a certain persona, almost like a sort of pop culture version of the writer that shows up in various places. Maybe in TV shows or movies, or we just hear that writer referenced a lot. People just mention the name a lot. I talk about this with Edgar Allan Poe, who of course is a famous American author from the 19th century. But even if you've never read The Raven, or The Telltale Heart, one of his most famous texts, you probably know who he is. Barnes & Noble used to have a sort of cartoon picture of him on some of their gift bags. He shows up on t-shirts, posters. There's lots of memes and, cartoonish versions of him out there on the internet. He shows up in comic books. He gets referenced in TV shows. So what that does, for people who haven't really read Poe, or in this case Shakespeare, they might not really know a lot about their work, but they know the person. They know this sort of persona, this pop culture version of the person, the writer. And I would argue that kind of happens with Shakespeare as well. You see images of Shakespeare, again, sort of cartoonish images. I can remember in college, when I was in college, there was this weird boom of Shakespeare themed clothing, usually with some kind of comic effect. But there'd be a cartoon version of Shakespeare saying something, or there'd be some quote from a play. And you didn't have to, it didn't matter if you had read that play. You understood what the shirt was. You understood who that was being pictured on the shirt. So he has this kind of relevance that really maybe transcends his actual literary output. And there are just certain things that we know about him. There are certain things that we think about him. And he represents, as a incredibly famous writer, he represents maybe larger ideas that we have about, I don't know, creativity, art, or at least as they relate to the stage, plays, but also, and this was something I picked up when I learned Shakespeare in school, but he also, in some ways, kind of helps to popularize certain notions of what we would consider like modern romance, like sort of pursuing love, over fortune. I mean, he wasn't the first writer to explore that, but something interesting about Romeo and Juliet to consider is, he's really writing sort of at the dawn of what we would maybe think of as like modernity. Like when we describe his language, Shakespeare is early modern English, right? He's not old English, he's not middle English, he's early modern, which does sound different, of course, than modern, right? But this is kind of the dawn of the modern age. And for a long time, you guys probably know this just from taking history classes, most marriages, a lot of coupledoms, were determined largely by finances and family fortunes, not really love. So certainly there was an idea of romantic love, but it was often thwarted in people's lives. It was often viewed as maybe less important than, securing your family's fortune or, moving, to a higher social status. So, part of what this play is tapping into, and I think part of the reason why it's still sort of relevant to modern audiences is, these are two characters who are pursuing romantic love, despite all of the social, cultural, barriers in their play, in their way. And of course, that's just like a staple of a lot of romances, a lot of what we see in romantic comedy. I wouldn't say that Shakespeare invented all of it, but he helped to popularize it and kind of canonize it in the Western cultural and literary tradition. This idea of a couple pursuing love, maybe impractical love, and making that the centerpiece of a lot of drama, a lot of character development. He helps to really push that forward and make it just the norm in a lot of our art, a lot of our literature, and other forms of art as well. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. Another reason why maybe he lives on as a figure, why the play lives on, why we still think about him, remember him. But, like scholars have talked about this. They say a lot of times when you teach Shakespeare in high school or college, to young students, oftentimes they're a bit underwhelmed. I mean, of course, the language can be a challenge, but even if all of that's navigated and you're sort of getting them all the information, the historical context that they need, maybe you even translate or gloss certain passages, modernize the language. Even if you do all of that, a lot of students are like, well, what's the big deal? A lot of movies are like this. I've read a lot of other stuff like this. Kind of missing the point that, but that's why, right? I mean, Shakespeare helps to inaugurate or enshrine a lot of templates, formats, motifs, themes that are so common to us now. We almost just sort of take them for granted and kind of forget that, they had to come from somewhere. Is it a pretty classic example of a romantic comedy? You can comment on that or think about that, the chemistry between the two leads. But are there also some feminist undertones, or is there sort of an explicit feminist commentary here through Paltrow's character and sort of some of what we see about the actual gender politics of the time period? So again, they are using some real history. The fact that women were barred from the stage during that time period, that's true, right? That is fact-based. So of course, we are rebelling against that. I think we're encouraged to want to see change, progress, but it's a little bit complicated, right? And I think we get a lot of, well, what some people might consider to be sort of a certain feminist message or orientation. Some of that might come from, Paltrow's character. Some of it might come from Judi Dench and Queen Elizabeth. But there's also this sense of duty, certain cultural expectations that you can't just change necessarily overnight. So I think it's kind of a nuanced portrait there. We are pushing for reform and some kind of progress, but also perhaps aware that, that's going to be difficult, and we're still, centuries removed from anything, of course, even approaching gender equality. So I think the film kind of shows us both sides of that. And was there anything else I really wanted to talk about? I don't think so. Oh yeah, just a few of the real life figures that show up. I did want to mention a few of these names. You probably already know them. Christopher Marlowe, another famous playwright, a contemporary of Shakespeare. He shows up in the film. You guys might be aware that for a long time there's been conspiracy theories out there. I would say they don't have a whole lot of substance to them, but a lot of conspiracies that say that, Marlowe actually wrote Shakespeare's plays, Shakespeare wasn't actually the author of his text. I've never seen any real compelling evidence to indicate that that's true. But again, what the film does show in that bar scene, which is kind of another example of an anachronism, there were certainly taverns and places to go and drink in the 1590s, but in that scene, it's very much configured like sort of a modern bar, and Will is a regular, again, sort of an updated version of an old-timey situation to kind of appeal to modern viewers. But we do see Shakespeare getting some advice from Marlowe, getting maybe a little bit of inspiration, and that's probably pretty accurate. I mean, again, there was a lot of borrowing going on, during the Elizabethan era from, amongst these playwrights. They did sometimes collaborate, they would work together. A lot of them, like Shakespeare, were working actors in addition to being writers. So in some cases, he might act in somebody else's play, and then he goes home and he's writing his own work. So there was a lot of crossover and sort of collaborative work. So it's not far-fetched to think that he might have gotten an idea or two from Marlowe, but no evidence that Marlowe actually wrote the play. But we do see him. He's played by Rupert Everett in the film. And then some other real-life people. Sir Richard Burbage was a famous actor of that time period. He shows up. Ned Allen was another real-life actor of that time period. He's played by Ben Affleck. Of course, Judi Dench playing Queen Elizabeth. We know that's a real person. And we know Shakespeare was real. We don't know all the details about his life, but we do know a fair amount, and the film captures some of those details. He was married to an older woman who owned some property. And I believe she already had children, but then later they did have children together, I think. But Shakespeare lived a lot of his time separate. He was in the city, pursuing his career, and he often spent time away from his family. So, he almost undoubtedly had other, relationships. We don't know all about those. I'm not sure about some of these, sort of comic liaisons that he seems to be carrying out early in the film. But they are taking certain things from his life and, of course, embellishing and fictionalizing others, which is artistic license. I think it's fun, and it worked well for a lot of people. Okay, so before we move to the film to the final paper, let me just wrap up by talking a little bit about that year's Oscar ceremony. So I've already mentioned one reason why it's still kind of remembered, just the fact that this film won Best Picture, and that was a little bit of a surprise. But when everybody went up on stage to accept the award, Weinstein was up there, along with the cast and Madden. I'm not sure if Stoppard and Norman were on stage, but, this is pretty typical. If a film wins Best Picture, a lot of the principal players are going to go up on stage. Director, main cast members, maybe screenwriter. Producers sometimes go up there, not always. Often, if producers go up on stage, they'll often kind of remain in the back. They might not really say much. But Weinstein kind of went in the opposite direction. He got up on stage, he was kind of vocal, and it rubbed some people the wrong way. They thought he was maybe taking too much credit for the film. But it was just part of this overall kind of brash, very sort of aggressive, like take no prisoners sort of reputation that he was developing throughout the 90s. So like we said, Miramax, I've already talked about Miramax and how it started out as this small indie company. They got bigger and bigger over the course of the late 80s and the 90s. They started to produce and distribute some very successful indies. And then they got bought by Disney, but they continued to operate pretty autonomously, doing movies like Good Will Hunting. So Weinstein was becoming quite famous within, Hollywood, and people were writing about him, talking about him, and he was developing this reputation as sort of difficult, hard-charging, brash. But later we learned more. But another thing that he did during the lead up to the Oscars in '99 was there was just this real like blitzkrieg of PR. That's how it was described. I don't have the quote in front of me anymore, but one critic at the time described it as an aggressive blitzkrieg of promotion for this film once it was nominated as one of the best pictures. So, this isn't terribly uncommon today. Like, we see really organized PR campaigns around big movies that are going to be award candidates. So often this will consist of a lot of film festivals where the director and the actors will go to screenings and they'll give interviews, and then they'll do these other like bigger sort of press junkets where they're going to different places, maybe going to premieres, talking to journalists. Maybe even doing like some like fan conventions and stuff. I don't know. But there was a lot of that that went into the promotion of this film. Sort of a relentless round of screenings and premieres and interviews. And people noticed at the time. I don't know that it would really cause a lot of waves today. But in the end of the 90s, it was sort of unusual, especially for a kind of literary film that wasn't a big action blockbuster, kind of appealing maybe to a slightly different audience, though again had a very broad audience, but it was considered by many to be in poor taste, to be sort of gauche, to promote a film as aggressively as Miramax was, or Weinstein in particular, was promoting this one. And again, I don't know that that really matters to us very much 25 years later, but one thing that film historians have pointed out and other critics is that Weinstein kind of helped to make this normal. He helped to make that kind of aggressive PR campaign pretty typical for future films that were hoping to bring home big awards. So, that's a change that some people regarded as a negative change, because Weinstein had this sort of, kind of brutal approach to making movies, and it was bringing him a lot of financial success, a lot of critical success, because these films got good reviews. They were obviously very much acclaimed and celebrated, but increasingly, we were hearing more and more sort of troubling reports about Weinstein himself, his behavior. But like I mentioned weeks ago when we first sort of brought this up, there were a lot of kind of, I would call it sort of an open secret, that he was a creep and somebody who was, kind of a predator. Like, people made jokes about it. It's, a lot of this work has already been done, but there's sort of a whole archive that you can find online of like Harvey Weinstein jokes on late night TV and award shows from the 90s and the early 2000s, and indicates that a lot of people knew at least a little bit of what he was doing. But then, of course, when Me Too happened about, I guess that was maybe 7 years ago, he really was at the center of that. Tons of allegations corroborated. He went to court. He was convicted. and he's almost certainly going to spend the rest of his life in prison. I think he's up on even more rape charges now. He's already serving time, but they might just add more years and make it truly impossible for him to, ever get out. So we know all of that. I don't want to rehash it, but just to kind of wrap up here with this particular film, interesting quote from John Madden, the director, and I wish I had it. I've somehow lost it. Couldn't find it before getting started today, but I'll just summarize. On one hand, he does what a lot of these other filmmakers have done. Tarantino, Smith, they all claim that they didn't know the extent of Weinstein's offenses. They knew he was a creepy guy that made a lot of the actresses uncomfortable, but they did not realize, what a serial predator and abuser he was. So Madden kind of echoes that. Madden's like, I didn't know. And it might be a little more plausible from Madden because he didn't have a prior working relationship with Weinstein, to my knowledge, the way Smith and Tarantino did. They were kind of close to him personally. But Madden didn't know him as well, claimed that he didn't know. But when interviewed about it, years later, he did make, I think, a pretty important point. He said, obviously, he's a monstrous guy, but maybe, talking about Weinstein, but maybe the bigger sort of structural problem at work was that Weinstein was allowed to have too much power. He had too much power as an important studio head. He could make or break careers. And that's something Madden pointed out. He said he really liked having power. He wanted people to know that he had power. So the fact that the studio was so successful did ultimately have this sort of negative outcome, just in the sense that Weinstein was able to achieve a level of prominence and power and influence that allowed him to abuse a lot of people. He probably would have abused people regardless of his path in life, but because Miramax became what it became, and because so many of their movies were successful, he just sort of had a bigger platform. He had access to a ton of ambitious young actresses, and because people knew that he could make or break careers, he wielded that power to basically demand sexual favors. And when people refused, he would take action to try to, prevent them from finding work. So I think I mentioned that before. Tons of actresses came forward, with stories about him, including Uma Thurman, including Mira Sorvino, who was kind of blacklisted. Rose McGowan also kind of blacklisted from Hollywood because of Weinstein, because he was able to make it very difficult for them to get cast in movies because they had already come forward and sort of talked about what he had done, not always to the authorities, but they had told friends, they had told other people, in the industry. And Gwyneth Paltrow was another actress who made allegations about Weinstein. As far as I understand, nothing happened on this particular film, but he might have been barred from the set like he was later by Tarantino on Kill Bill, because Uma Thurman, didn't want him there. And Paltrow was another one of those actresses who spoke out about him and about what he had done. So that kind of maybe casts a little bit of a dark cloud over the film. I don't think we should look at the film any differently, just like we don't need to look at Good Will Hunting any differently based on Weinstein's involvement. But I do think we should consider what Madden's saying about power and too much power. And it kind of takes us back to where we started at the very beginning of the semester. The whole part of the whole independent film movement in this country, a big part of it was based on wanting to get away from the old Hollywood power structure, where those big studios had so much control over the careers, the livelihoods of actors, directors, screenwriters, camera operators, makeup artists, all of the different people that it takes to make a movie. And I don't think, Cassavetes and, the Johns, the early independent filmmaking sort of pioneers that we talked about at the beginning of the semester, I don't know that they were thinking so much about sexual abuse, but they definitely viewed studios and studio executives as just sort of inherently exploitative. Just their very existence. They lived off the work of others, and they could control where people could work, what movies they could get made. They controlled payment. They controlled, pay scales. And if you crossed them or did something they didn't like, they could make sure that you weren't going to work again. So people like John Cassavetes, who went and created his own studio, his own production company, said, I don't like the studio model. He worked within it as an actor. And he saw it up close and personal. He said, I don't like this. I don't like this. This isn't the best atmosphere for creating art. So a lot of independent filmmakers said, we don't want to work with big studios. We don't want to be told what we can or can't do. And I think at least a part of that is we don't want megalomaniac studio execs like Harvey Weinstein stealing our thunder, coming to the set, telling us what to do, or just taking the credit for the work. So I think it's important to kind of remember that. That's a big part of independent film's origin story in this country, is trying to get away from the old studio model that ran, filmmaking for a very long time in this country. But we've kind of come full circle almost. I mean, we started by trying to get away from the studio system, and when we watched some of our early films like Stranger Than Paradise, Parting Glances, Roger and Me, it felt like we were pretty far removed from the world of big Hollywood studios. A lot of our films have been far removed. Daughters of the Dust, Clerks, I think, felt pretty far removed. But we should notice that here at the end of the semester, we're watching movies that don't really feel all that independent. Like we talked about this with Good Will Hunting. We have big budgets now, really high production quality. We don't see any of those telltale signs of a low budget or a first-time filmmaker, like maybe a lack of camera movement, non-professional actors, black and white film stock. We don't see any of that, right? We don't see any clear markers that this is small, cheap, arty, independent. It feels like a crowd-pleasing Hollywood film, and for the most part, that is what it is. So that might be sort of a sad tale to some. I don't know. To others, it might be a good thing. But clearly, independent film has become more accessible and more mainstream here at the end of the 90s than it was when we first started out. And of course, the argument could be made that by the 90s, independent film, at least by like the second half of the 90s, independent film has changed a lot. And it's still out there. Certainly, there's still independent studios. There's still filmmakers going out there sort of doing the DIY thing, not getting funding from major studios. But what we've seen is if you have success, if you make a good film, and it gets picked up by a distributor, and people watch it, and people like it, and critics like it, chances are, at some point, a big studio is going to come calling. You might get purchased. You might get a bigger deal. Yeah, in some cases, the small indie studios get purchased by bigger entities. That's happened a lot. In other cases, the individual filmmakers who might start out very much indie, they get a chance to do a bigger film with a bigger studio, and that's often how these careers go. So just kind of notice the trajectory. We started very much off the beaten path. We were very much starting out outside the studio model, and by the end, maybe we're back inside the studio model, and maybe certain things about how studios work and how much power studio executives wield, maybe that's part of the story of Weinstein and all the awful things that he did. So Madden's kind of advice or message there was that we just need to make sure that individuals don't get into those kinds of positions where they have that much power over people. But I'm not sure if the industry's really listening to that, and I'm not sure if we've really seen anything that we would call reform or big change. There's just maybe a greater awareness now of these things, how often they happen, and maybe a little bit more vigilance. But I don't know. That's up for you. That's up to you guys to kind of decide on all of that. All right. So let's talk about the final paper. the assignment's already posted in the module. It was in the week 14 module. I'm sorry, it was in the week 13 module, and it also appears in the week 14. So you can take a look, read the instructions at your leisure. I don't want to go back over all of that, but just keep in mind this is an 8 to 10 page paper, not terribly long, but it is a research paper. This is going to be very similar to the literary research paper that you've had to write before in some previous class, maybe a 400 level, if you've taken 451, maybe at the 300 level. But we've all probably done a paper like this, a literary research paper in which we are developing our own argument, our own original interpretation of a text. The only real difference here is that instead of tackling a work of literature, we are, of course, writing about a film. But I would really encourage you guys to think about this largely as just, a pretty typical English paper, with a few differences that are, of course, just a result of looking at film instead of a written text. But in terms of just your basic approach, developing a thesis, the kind of work that I want to see, it's very, very similar. This is still an English class after all. So pick a film, any of the films that we've watched so far. Pick the one that you would most like to write about. I've already mentioned that if you've written a critical response that you think you could expand, if you were getting into some stuff there that you were really interested in, and you want to revisit some of that material, or you just really like that particular film and you want to write about it at length, I would recommend going back to that response, seeing the best stuff in there, seeing what you can build on. I really don't want you to recycle exact sentences or paragraphs from that original response, but I want you to you can certainly rework some of that material, build on some of that material, and see what else you can do with it. But it's also fine if you just want to tackle a film that you haven't previously written about, but a film that you have a lot to say about. And remember, these should be argumentative, just like any paper of this sort. You should have an original interpretation of your own. You don't have to exist completely on the thematic level, if you know what I mean by that. Like, when you're interpreting a film, on some level, you're always going to be telling us kind of what the film means, what it says, what's the message, what's the meaning, what's the theme. We're always doing a little bit of that when we interpret, when we analyze. But that doesn't necessarily have to be your sole focus. You don't have to be intent on just basically telling us what the movie says, what the overall message is. You might mention it, you might get into it, but you can also tell us something more specific. I mean, you can zero in on a more specific aspect of the film, but you do need to show the significance of it. If the significance of that particular aspect or element is that it expresses a key theme, well, that's fine. You can tell us that and show us that. But there could be some other interesting effects to explore. Certain statements that these things might make, certain impacts that they might have on viewers, certain influences that they might sort of illustrate, other things that they might be doing. So there's a lot of ways that you can go, but I would encourage you to kind of start in the same way that you would start one of our short response papers. Pick a film and then sort of, search for that entry point or that angle, that particular aspect or element of the film that you're interested in, so you can start digging and analyzing, and generating material for the paper. But you might decide that there are several different things that you're interested in. So when you're kind of figuring out what you want to say about your film, what you want to explore, how you're going to get into your analysis, I recommend thinking on two levels. Go back to our familiar literary elements on one hand. We should know these by now. Characters, plot, of course, theme. Stuff like imagery, symbolism, any kind of figurative language that you might find in a screenplay, but also, character development is always fair game. Setting would be another thing that you could talk about. So those are the kinds of elements that we can always discuss when we are reading fiction, a short story or a novel, maybe a play or a poem. But they're also fair game when you're analyzing movies. A lot of these elements are also at work in the movies. So you can always talk about those, but on the other level, think about some of the specific cinematic techniques that we have discussed over the course of this semester. Some of the technical aspects that are unique to film. So cinematography, mise-en-scene, you can even get more specific. Talk about lighting, talk about makeup, talk about costumes. And of course, you can talk specifically about some of the creative forces at work on these films. If you're really taken by the camera work, then you need to hop online and get the name of the cinematographer of the film. Sometimes they might be called directors of photography. There might be a slight difference in those titles, but not enough for us to really worry about it. But you can find that information very quickly, and you might want to talk about that cinematographer specifically in your paper. Same with, costume designer, or you might think about production design in general, because production design, that includes usually sets, costumes, makeup, a lot of the visual elements separate from cinematography. So maybe you want to talk about the production designer. Maybe you want to talk about the director. That's pretty common. You might want to attribute a lot of what we see in the film to the director. You might want to talk about the screenwriters. You can talk about specific actors, whatever you want. But it wouldn't hurt to maybe go to IMDb or find the Wikipedia page just so you can get all the names that you need for your film. Any name that you want to talk about, any particular role that you think is important, you can get that name and talk about that particular person. So, think about both of those categories, the old traditional literary elements that we've been working with for a long time, and then these sort of newer cinematic elements that we might, we're not as familiar with them, and we don't need to be experts. You're really just using your own observations, and judging from our discussion board and your earlier response papers, plenty of you are fluent. Most of us are very fluent with these terms. You know exactly, how to discuss a lot of these technical elements. Again, it's not a film class. We're not striving for mastery. We just want to show that we are paying attention, right, to certain cinematic techniques or elements. Again, maybe you want to really jump into the screenplay. Like maybe you're writing about Good Will Hunting and you think the best part of the film, or perhaps the most important part, is the screenplay, the way the characters are developed, the dialogue, what it reveals. So maybe, you really want to focus on that so you can kind of stay literary while still treating something uniquely cinematic. And a lot of these screenplays are available for free online. So you can treat them just like any other written text that you might study and analyze. So yeah, it's really not different. The kind of work we're doing here, film analysis, is really not that different from literary analysis. You're making the same kind of moves. You're making the same kind of claims. You want to drive home an original argument. The only difference is the nature of the text that you are analyzing. It's not a strictly written text now, so there are some of these visual elements that you might want to address. And just even something like close reading, which is a technique we often do in a paper about a work of literature, we can do it with a film as well. Close reading is just to really jump into a specific passage, a specific moment. For a written text, this might be a paragraph or just a single page of a novel, and we're just really looking at the language of that particular passage. We're really interested in individual words, individual metaphors, maybe even punctuation, and how everything's working on the level of words, sentences, and paragraphs. Now, if we close read a movie, we're going to be looking for different things, but we can make similar moves. So we can really just take an individual scene or maybe a sequence. A scene is usually just, a sort of singular action, something taking place in a single location with a particular person or group of people. And as soon as the action or the location changes, we're probably on to a new scene. So a lot of times scenes will only last for a couple of minutes, maybe a few minutes of runtime. So we could isolate an individual scene and close read it. We could also do a sequence, which is often a sort of related linkage of individual scenes, right? That kind of make up a little mini narrative. So we could do that as well, but that level of specificity is going to help us. We can't make all of our points about the entire film in general. We have to get specific. We have to get granular. Let's go to individual scenes. Let's go to individual lines of dialogue. Let's talk about specific characters. Let's talk about specific moments, events, and elements. That's the level of specificity we need, for a paper like this. So as we get started, and we can talk more about your ideas and what you want to do when we conference next week, but as you're getting started, I would really recommend, as you're choosing a film, I recommend choosing one that you have ready access to. Just like with a work of literature, it's always good to have that novel sitting next to you as you are writing. You want to take notes in there. You want to annotate, highlight stuff. Kind of the same thing with a film. You're not going to mark it up, but you want to be able to go back and rewatch your chosen film. So I know you guys are resourceful. You know how to find these films online. But in the event that you've been renting, I know some of us have probably been renting these films. That's fine. But you might want to go back and choose one that you have for free. If you have free access to it, or if you've already purchased it, that might be, that might help influence your decision, because you want to have a film that you can return to. You want to be able to rewatch at least parts of it. You might not rewatch the entire thing, but you want to go back and rewatch individual scenes. You want to have the power to hit stop or pause, maybe rewind, whatever. So just remember that, and maybe start taking some notes, just getting some ideas down on paper. What do you want to argue? What do you want to tell us? What are some individual scenes, characters, whatever, that you want to explore? And just think of it, I always tell people this, but it's a good way to approach any literary or cinematic analysis paper. You need to make an original contribution. Okay, so all of these films have been written about. All of these films have been studied, analyzed, reviewed. People have talked about them, argued about them. So you are entering some kind of ongoing, pre-existing critical conversation, no matter what film you choose. So what can you contribute to this larger debate that's going on? What can you contribute within this larger context of the conversation already existing around your film? What do you bring to the table? What is your new original thing to offer us? Think about it that way. Don't just rehash what other people have said. I want something original from you. But we are doing research for this paper, so you'll notice that in my instructions. I want you guys to have between 4 and 6 outside sources. Some of these might be reviews. Movie reviews can be useful. They're not necessarily scholarly sources, though. They can help, but I would encourage you guys to find at least a couple of academic, like journal articles or maybe books, book chapters, peer-reviewed stuff written by film scholars. Not just critics, but scholars. I would like some academic sources. And you might be surprised, there's a lot of academic study of film. That's not just something that exists for literature, it also exists for film. So if you hop on the GBC library databases, if you're using EBSCO or JSTOR, you can find a lot of good articles, a lot of good scholarly academic articles about popular films. So you need to start looking around. That's one of our early steps. Acquaint yourself with the critical conversation that's already going on about your film. You need to know a little bit about what people have said about the film. Did people like it when it came out? Has the critical evaluation changed over time? Was it critically successful but not very popularly successful in terms of like making money? You can get all of that information very quickly. Just learn a little bit more about your film. And I don't mind at this early stage if you guys want to go on Wikipedia or I mentioned IMDb. Those are good places to just get basic facts about your film. They're not going to count towards your official sources. Wikipedia never will. IMDb, no. Probably not. But those are still good places to look early on, like I said, just to get acquainted. And then you can find better sources that will actually appear in your paper a little bit later on. So just remember, at the end of this week, at the end of week 14, I'd like you to complete the proposal and critical summary. So I am sorry to give you 2 assignments this week. I know you have the final response paper and the proposal and critical summary. That's why I kind of recommended maybe getting a jump on the proposal a little bit early if that was possible. But don't sweat the proposal too much. I just want a general idea of what you want to write about, and then we can talk about it more during our conference in week 15. And as for the critical summary, that's kind of part of the proposal. They're 2 different things, but you can just put them together in the same document. But I just want to see that you are beginning to do some research this week. You can just talk about 2 or 3 of the sources that you found so far. You'll need more eventually, but just tell me how the research is going. What are you finding? What are you reading? What are you learning? And we can just kind of get the ball rolling with those documents, but then you can bring them with you or just have them submitted when you come to your video conference next week, and I can pull them up on my own device and we can talk about them, look at them while we're talking. Okay, so I have the schedule up for video conferences. Just pick a time. If you can use Google Docs, you should be able to edit the doc. If you can't use Google Docs, just let me know a time that works for you. You might want to give me 2 or 3 times just to make sure you get something that will work. There's only 8 of us, so I don't think it's going to be hard to find time for everyone, but just take a look at the schedule. Let me know if you have questions, and I will see you guys in your conferences next week.